On the scorched Montana plains where Willow Creek had run dry for the first time in living memory, Thomas Wallace and his cattle dog Copper stumbled upon 3 dying foals trapped in a ravine of cracked mud and bleached stones. The smallest could barely lift her head. But what happened 3 days later, when the impossible sound of hoofbeats shattered the pre-dawn silence, would shake Tom's understanding of loss, hope, and second chances to its very core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The August sun had turned the Montana high plains into something resembling the surface of a forgotten planet. Heat rose in visible waves from the hardpan earth, distorting the horizon until sky and land blurred into a single shimmering wall of pale gold. Thomas Wallace stood at the edge of what used to be Willow Creek, a waterway that had carved through his property for as long as anyone could remember, now reduced to a snaking scar of white stone and powder-fine dust. He was 48 but felt considerably older. The kind of aging that doesn't show in mirrors but settles into joints and accumulates behind the eyes. His hands, scarred and permanently darkened by sun and work, hung loose at his sides as he surveyed the devastation. Around him, the prairie grass had lost its green months ago, turning first yellow, then brown, and finally to something like ash. Even the sagebrush looked defeated. Copper sat beside him, the old cattle dog's tongue lolling in the heat. The dog's coat, once a vibrant reddish-brown that had earned him his name, had dulled with age and dust. White hairs peppered his muzzle now, and his movements carried the careful deliberation of a creature whose body had begun negotiating with time. Still, his eyes remained sharp, constantly scanning the landscape with the vigilance bred into his bloodline over generations. Tom's property, which he'd stopped calling a ranch years ago out of sheer honesty, consisted of 240 acres that had once supported a modest herd of cattle and a life he'd built with his wife, Caroline. The main house had burned 2 years back, an electrical fire that started in the walls while he was out checking fence lines. By the time he'd seen the smoke and driven back, there was nothing to save but some photographs he'd kept in the truck and the clothes on his back. Insurance had paid out less than expected. Rebuilding seemed impossible, so he'd converted the old red barn into living quarters, a process that mostly involved clearing out 30 years of accumulated tools, hay bales, and the general debris of agricultural life, then setting up a cot, a propane stove, and a few shelves. It wasn't much. Some nights, lying on that cot and listening to mice skitter through the hayloft, he wondered if he'd crossed some invisible line from self-sufficient to simply stubborn. The bank had opinions about his situation. They'd expressed these opinions in a series of letters that now lived in a shoebox under his cot, each one slightly more urgent than the last. Foreclosure was a word that appeared with increasing frequency. Tom had stopped opening them 3 weeks ago, not out of defiance but simple exhaustion. He knew what they said. Reading the specific dates and dollar amounts wouldn't change the fundamental mathematics of his situation. He'd sold off most of the cattle over the past year. The remaining dozen head clustered near the barn where he'd set up a water tank he filled daily by hauling it in from town, a grinding routine that ate up fuel he could barely afford. The drought had killed the well. Or rather, the drought had lowered the water table beyond what his pump could reach, which amounted to the same thing. Copper suddenly stood, ears forward, a low whine building in his throat. Tom followed the dog's gaze across the expanse of dried creek bed. At first, he saw nothing but the usual desolation. Then Copper took 3 steps forward and barked, sharp and insistent. "What is it, boy?" The dog barked again, then took off at a run, moving with surprising speed for his age. Tom swore under his breath and followed, boots sliding on the loose stones that littered the creek bed. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and within minutes sweat soaked through his shirt. Copper had disappeared around a bend where the creek used to pool during spring runoff, a place shaded by 3 ancient cottonwoods that had somehow survived the drought, though their leaves hung limp and yellowing. When Tom rounded the bend, he found Copper standing at the edge of a ravine he'd forgotten existed, a deeper cut in the creek bed where the water had once carved out a pocket before continuing downstream. The dog was barking continuously now, a sound of urgency Tom had learned to recognize over their years together. He approached carefully, the ground here unstable, and looked down into the ravine. What he saw stopped him cold. 3 foals lay in the depression, their bodies pressed against each other in the meager shade cast by the ravine's western wall. They weren't moving. For several heartbeats, Tom thought they were dead, another casualty of the brutal summer. Then the largest one, a sorrel-colored filly with a coat dulled by dust and dehydration, lifted her head slightly. The movement was weak, barely coordinated, and her head dropped back down almost immediately. Tom's mind raced through the implications. Wild horses sometimes ranged through this area, though he hadn't seen any in months. These foals were young, probably born in spring, which meant they were only a few months old. Far too young to survive on their own. The fact that they were together suggested they'd been abandoned as a group, or their mothers had met some fate that left the babies stranded. The ravine was perhaps 8 feet deep, its sides steep and crumbling. The foals had likely wandered in when it was cooler, seeking shelter, then became too weak to climb out. Looking at them now, Tom could see their ribs pressing against hide, the sunken quality around their eyes that spoke of severe dehydration. They were dying, and they were doing it slowly. He looked at Copper, who had stopped barking and now sat watching Tom with an expression that seemed almost expectant. The dog knew they'd found something that required action. What that action should be was the question. Tom's first instinct was practical calculation. 3 dying foals represented a problem he couldn't afford. Feed was expensive. Water was scarce. The bank was circling. He had no facilities for horses, no experience with foals this young. The reasonable thing, the thing that made sense given his circumstances, would be to call the county and let them handle it. Deputy Crawford handled animal control issues. It would become someone else's problem. He stood there for a long moment, heat radiating off the pale stones, Copper panting beside him, and the foals barely breathing below. In his mind, he could hear Caroline's voice, that particular tone she'd used when he was overthinking something. She'd grown up on a ranch 3 times the size of his, had forgotten more about horses than he'd ever known, and she'd had a way of cutting through his tendency to get paralyzed by practical considerations. "Tom," she would have said, "are you really going to stand there doing math while those babies die?" He wasn't. He knew it even as the thought formed. Whatever the cost, whatever the complications, he couldn't walk away from this. Some decisions got made before the brain caught up with the heart. Getting down into the ravine proved challenging. The sides were unstable, dirt and small stones sliding away under his weight. He half climbed, half slid down, landing harder than intended. Up close, the foals looked even worse. Their breathing was shallow and rapid, a bad sign. The smallest one, a pale cream-colored filly, hadn't moved at all since he'd first spotted them. Tom knelt beside the sorrel filly who'd raised her head earlier. He placed a hand gently on her neck. Her skin was hot and dry, lacking the elasticity that indicated proper hydration. When he lifted her upper lip to check her gums, they were tacky and pale. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She didn't resist his examination, which told him how far gone she was. A healthy foal would have fought or at least tried to move away. The second foal, dappled gray with a coat that might have been beautiful under better circumstances, lay with her legs tucked beneath her. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and she flinched weakly when Tom touched her. The third, the tiny cream-colored one, felt almost skeletal under his hands. Her breathing was barely perceptible. He sat back on his heels, assessing. They needed water immediately, but he couldn't give them too much too fast or they'd founder. They needed to get out of this ravine and into shade with better air circulation. They needed veterinary attention he probably couldn't pay for. They needed their mothers, which they clearly didn't have. What they had was him and an aging cattle dog and a converted barn 20 minutes away by foot. Tom climbed back out of the ravine, his mind already working through logistics. Copper watched him intently. "Stay here," Tom commanded, pointing at the dog. "Guard them." Copper immediately lay down at the ravine's edge, settling into position with the absolute focus of a dog given a job he understood. Tom knew the animal would stay there even if it took hours, would bark if anything approached, would protect those foals as if they were his own flock. The walk back to the barn felt longer than it should have. Tom's boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, and the sun hammered down with the mindless intensity of a cosmic forge. By the time he reached the barn, his shirt was soaked through and his throat felt lined with sandpaper. He grabbed his truck keys, considered the water situation, and made a decision. He had 3 50-gallon drums of water he'd been rationing for his remaining cattle. He loaded 2 5-gallon buckets, a coil of rope, several old blankets, and a stack of towels into the truck bed. From the small propane refrigerator he'd salvaged from the burned house, he grabbed a gallon jug of water he'd been keeping cold. Then he drove, faster than the rough dirt track really allowed, back toward Willow Creek. The truck bounced and skidded over the uneven ground. Tom had stopped maintaining this path years ago when the creek ran dry, and it showed. He got as close as he could to the ravine, parked, and hauled the supplies the remaining distance on foot. Copper was exactly where he'd left him, though the dog's tail thumped the ground when Tom appeared. Getting the foals out of the ravine required a combination of brute strength and improvisation that left Tom's back screaming. He fashioned a sling from one of the blankets, slid it under the first foal, and used the rope to help distribute the weight as he climbed out. The sorrel filly, whom he'd mentally started calling Ember for the hint of red gold that showed through the dust on her coat, barely responded to being moved. She was dead weight in his arms, maybe 70 pounds of dehydrated horse. He laid her in the shade of the truck, draped a damp towel over her body to help cool her, and went back for the second. The gray one fought him weakly when he tried to secure the blanket sling, which he took as a positive sign. Any fight left in her meant she wasn't as far gone as the others. He called her Clover in his mind, for no reason he could articulate except that the name felt right. The third foal, the smallest, was the hardest. She was so light he could have carried her like a child, but her limpness terrified him. He could feel her heart beating against his chest as he climbed out of the ravine, a flutter so faint and rapid it felt like holding a dying bird. Willow, he thought. She looked like a willow in winter, all fragile bone and faded color. With all 3 foals in the truck bed, cushioned by blankets and shaded as much as possible by the truck's canopy, Tom faced the next challenge: water. He poured some of the cold water from the jug onto a towel and used it to wet each foal's mouth, letting small amounts dribble onto their tongues. Too much and they'd choke. Not enough and they'd die anyway. It was a calculation he had to get right. Ember responded first, her tongue moving weakly to lick at the moisture. Clover's eyes opened wider, gaining a fraction more awareness. Willow didn't respond at all, and Tom's stomach tightened with dread. He wet his fingers and rubbed them along her gums, trying to stimulate some reaction. Nothing. He tried again, more insistently. "Come on, little girl," he murmured. "Don't quit on me now." Her tongue moved, barely, but it moved. Tom exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He continued the slow process of hydration, a few drops at a time, talking to them in the low, steady voice he'd once used to calm spooked cattle. Copper sat nearby, watching the proceedings with the grave attention of a supervisor evaluating critical work. The drive back to the barn was agonizingly slow. Tom took every rut and bump at a crawl, trying not to jostle the foals more than necessary. Through the rear window, he could see them lying in a small huddle, their bodies touching as if seeking comfort from each other. That instinct, that drive to stay close even in extremity, said something about their chances. They hadn't given up. Not entirely. The barn, when he pulled up to it, looked more ramshackle than usual. Faded red paint peeled in long strips. The roof sagged slightly on the north side where the beams had settled over decades. The large sliding door hung crooked on its track. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and right now shelter mattered more than aesthetics. Tom backed the truck as close to the barn entrance as possible and began the process of moving the foals inside. The barn's interior was marginally cooler than outside, shaded and with better air circulation through the gaps in the boards. He'd cleared a space in what used to be the tack room, spreading fresh straw he'd bought for his cattle. Now he laid the foals on it, arranging them so they could see each other. The rest of the afternoon became a blur of focused activity. Tom mixed electrolyte solution from packets he'd found in his veterinary supplies, remnants from his cattle-raising days. He administered it slowly using a large syringe without the needle, squirting small amounts into each foal's mouth and waiting for them to swallow before continuing. Between sessions, he sponged them down with cool water, trying to lower their body temperatures gradually. Copper appointed himself guardian, lying across the doorway where he could watch both the foals and the approach to the barn. The dog's presence was oddly comforting, as if having another living creature invested in this project made it less insane. By evening, when the sun finally began its descent and the temperature dropped from unbearable to merely oppressive, Tom had seen small improvements. Ember had lifted her head twice on her own. Clover's eyes tracked him when he moved around the space. Willow remained the most critical, but her breathing had steadied somewhat, becoming less frantic and shallow. Tom sat on an overturned bucket, his back against the barn wall, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of exhaustion. His muscles ached. His hands trembled slightly from sustained effort. But the foals were alive, at least for now, and that counted as a victory even if it was temporary. The last light of day filtered through the barn's gaps, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Tom watched the three small bodies breathing, their sides rising and falling in the dimness, and thought about the commitment he'd just made without really meaning to. These weren't cattle he could sell when times got tough. They weren't even adult horses that might eventually carry their weight on a working ranch. They were babies that would require months of intensive care, significant expense, and attention he wasn't sure he could afford to give. The smart thing would still be to call Deputy Crawford in the morning, explain the situation, let the county's resources handle it. They had facilities, experienced people, budgets for this kind of thing. Tom had a converted barn, declining funds, and the specter of foreclosure. But as he sat there, Kappa's warm weight against his leg and the soft sounds of equine breathing filling the space, Tom knew he wouldn't make that call. Not tomorrow. Not the day after. These foals had somehow become his responsibility in the moment he'd looked down into that ravine. Walking away now would be walking away from something more than 3 dying animals. It would be walking away from the part of himself that still believed things were worth saving. Outside, the prairie night settled in with its vast silence. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to each other in voices that sounded almost like laughter. The wind picked up, carrying the dusty smell of drought and the faint promise of storms that never seemed to arrive. Tom rose stiffly, checked the foals one more time, and made his way to his cot on the other side of the barn. Sleep came hard, interrupted by worry and the unfamiliar sounds of horses in distress. Twice he got up to check on them, to offer more water, to reassure himself they were still breathing. The second time, Copper followed him, and together they stood watching over the foals like mismatched sentries guarding something precious and fragile. Dawn would bring new challenges, Tom knew. Veterinary bills he couldn't pay, feed he couldn't afford, the judgment of neighbors who would say he'd lost his mind. But for tonight, in this barn that smelled of straw and animal warmth, with 3 foals clinging to life and a loyal dog at his side, Tom Wallace felt something he hadn't experienced in the 2 years since fire had taken his house and grief had hollowed out his chest. He felt needed, and that, he realized, might be worth any cost. The first full night with the foals tested every assumption Tom had made about his capacity for sleeplessness. He'd thought years of ranching had prepared him for interrupted rest, for the kind of vigilance that requires checking on newborn calves or listening for predators in the dark. But this was different. The foals weren't just vulnerable in the way of young livestock. They were fundamentally compromised, balanced on a knife's edge between survival and surrender, and that precarious state demanded a level of attention that left no room for actual sleep. Around 2 in the morning, Tom gave up on the cot entirely and dragged it into the makeshift stall area. He positioned it where he could reach out and touch any of the 3 foals without getting up, where every shift in their breathing would wake him, where he could monitor the small signs that might indicate improvement or decline. Copper had already claimed the space directly in front of the stall entrance, his body forming a living barrier between the foals and whatever dangers the night might hold. The barn's interior held a peculiar quality in darkness. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the boards, creating bars of pale illumination that moved slowly across the floor as the night progressed. The old structure creaked and settled, producing sounds that in daylight went unnoticed but at night took on an almost conversational quality, as if the building itself were commenting on the unusual situation unfolding within its walls. Ember, the sorrel filly, was the first to show genuine signs of recovery. Around 3 o'clock, Tom woke to find her attempting to lift her head, neck straining with the effort. The movement was uncoordinated and weak, but it was deliberate. She was trying. He sat up immediately, speaking in low tones that wouldn't startle her. "Easy now. Take your time. No rush." Her eyes found him in the dimness, large and dark and still clouded with distress but carrying a spark of awareness that hadn't been there hours before. Tom reached for the electrolyte solution he'd mixed fresh before attempting sleep, drew it into the syringe and offered it slowly. This time, instead of passively accepting the liquid, Ember's lips worked around the syringe tip, actively seeking the moisture. It was a small thing, this shift from passive to active participation in her own survival, but it felt monumental. He spent 20 minutes with her, offering solution in small amounts, pausing between to let her rest and process. By the time he finished, she had managed to prop herself up on her chest, front legs tucked beneath her in a more natural resting position. Her head still drooped with exhaustion, but the improvement from the limp, sprawled creature he'd pulled from the ravine was remarkable. Clover, the dappled gray, remained in that middle ground between crisis and recovery. She was breathing steadily, and when Tom checked her gums, they showed slightly better color than before. But she hadn't attempted to move beyond small adjustments of her position, and when he offered electrolytes she accepted them with mechanical swallowing rather than Ember's nascent enthusiasm. Her eyes opened when he worked with her but didn't track his movements with any real focus. Willow worried him most. The tiny cream-colored filly lay exactly as he'd positioned her hours ago, sides barely moving with each shallow breath. Her eyes remained closed. When he ran his hands over her body, checking for response, she gave none. He administered fluids as carefully as he could, terrified she might choke, and felt a profound relief each time her throat worked to swallow. But she was fading. He could feel it in the quality of her stillness, in the way her body seemed to be withdrawing from the world 1 degree at a time. Tom sat back on the cot as the first hints of dawn began replacing moonlight with something grayer and more diffuse. Copper raised his head, ears swiveling toward the barn entrance, then settled again when no threat materialized. Outside, the prairie morning was beginning its daily transformation from cool darkness to building heat, that brief window when the temperature was almost comfortable before the sun reasserted its dominance. He must have dozed for a short while because the next thing he registered was full daylight streaming through the barn's eastern gaps and the sound of a vehicle approaching on the access road. Tom stood quickly, joints protesting, and moved to the barn entrance. A battered pickup truck, older even than his own, was making its way up the drive, trailing a plume of dust that hung in the still morning air. The truck parked near the barn and a teenage girl climbed out, moving with the efficient grace of someone comfortable with physical work. She was tall and lean, wearing jeans worn pale at the knees and a faded blue t-shirt. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her face carried that particular quality of guarded openness that Tom had noticed in young people who'd learned early that life didn't offer guarantees. "Mr. Wallace?" She approached with her hands visible, the way someone might approach a skittish animal, acknowledging that she was entering his space without invitation. "That's right." Tom didn't recognize her, which meant little in a county where families were spread across vast distances and social circles remained small and insular. "I'm Ruby Hastings. I live with my grandmother about 8 miles south of here, off Route 12. She gestured vaguely in that direction. "I was driving past yesterday evening and saw your truck parked down by the old creek bed. Saw you loading something into the back. Wasn't sure what, but this morning I heard at the feed store that someone had found horses in trouble." Tom processed this. The speed of rural gossip never ceased to amaze him. He'd found the foals less than 24 hours ago, and already word was making rounds. "Found 3 foals," he confirmed. "In bad shape. They're in the barn." Ruby's expression shifted, concern replacing the careful neutrality she'd worn approaching a stranger. "Can I see them?" Something in her tone suggested this wasn't idle curiosity. Tom stepped back, gesturing her inside. Copper stood as she entered, tail wagging slowly, performing his usual assessment of newcomers. Ruby extended her hand for the dog to sniff, waiting for his approval before proceeding further. The small gesture of respect for the animal's role as guardian raised her slightly in Tom's estimation. The morning light inside the barn was gentler than outside, filtered through dust and shadow. Ruby moved toward the stall area and stopped abruptly when she saw the foals. Her hand went to her mouth, and for a moment she just stood there, taking in the scene. Ember, still propped on her chest, tracked the newcomer with those large, dark eyes. Clover stirred slightly at the sound of a new voice. Willow remained motionless. "Oh God," Ruby said softly. "They're so young. What happened?" Tom moved to stand beside her, looking at the foals with her fresh perspective. "Found them in a ravine down by what used to be Willow Creek. No sign of their mothers. Best I can figure, they got separated somehow and the drought drove them to seek water that wasn't there. They were dying when I found them." Ruby knelt slowly at the stall entrance, extending her hand toward Ember the way she had with Copper, letting the filly see her and decide whether to accept the approach. Ember's nostrils flared, processing this new scent, but she didn't pull back. Ruby's fingers touched the filly's neck in a gesture so gentle it barely constituted contact. "You saved them," Ruby said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she understood the weight of that decision, the commitment it represented. "Trying to," Tom corrected. "That little one, the cream-colored, she's not responding much. The gray one's stable but weak. The sorrel girl, she's fighting. But they're all still in danger." Ruby stood and turned to face him directly. "I'd like to help, if you'll let me." Tom studied her. She couldn't be more than 16, 17 at most. "You know anything about horses?" "Grew up with them. My grandmother used to breed quarter horses before the arthritis got too bad. I've been handling horses since I could walk, helped with births, dealt with sick animals, all of it." She paused, then added with the bluntness of someone used to being underestimated, "I know I'm young, but I know what I'm doing, and I've got time. School doesn't start for another 3 weeks." "Why?" Tom asked, not aggressively but genuinely curious. "You don't know me. These aren't your horses. Why would you want to spend your last weeks of summer dealing with this?" Ruby's expression flickered with something complicated, some emotion that passed too quickly for Tom to identify. "Because they need help and I can give it. Does there need to be more reason than that?" It was a fair point and uncomfortably reminiscent of Tom's own thought process when deciding to pull the foals from the ravine. Need meeting capability, without requiring elaborate justification. He nodded slowly. "Appreciate the offer. Truth is, I could use another set of hands. These 3 are going to need round-the-clock care for a while, and I'm not as young as I used to be." A slight smile touched Ruby's face, the first break in her serious demeanor. "You're not that old, Mr. Wallace." "Tom, if you're going to be working here, might as well use my name." "Tom, then. And I'm Ruby. Not kid, not girl, Ruby." "Fair enough." Tom moved toward a shelf where he'd organized his limited supplies. "First thing we need to do is get more fluids into them. After that, I need to call the vet, see if Dr. Morgan will come out on credit. Then we'll need to figure out feeding schedules, monitoring protocols, all of it." Ruby pulled her phone from her pocket, checked the screen, then tucked it away. "Dr. Morgan's my grandmother's vet. Has been for 20 years. She'll come if I ask, and she'll work out payment later if money's tight." The casual way she acknowledged his financial situation, without judgment or pity, made something in Tom's chest ease slightly. Rural poverty was its own kind of community. Everyone knew who was struggling because most people were struggling in some way or another. The question wasn't whether you had resources, but whether you'd use what little you had to help when help was needed. They fell into a working rhythm with surprising ease. Ruby seemed to intuitively understand the care the foals required, moving slowly around them, speaking in those low, soothing tones that animals responded to. She took over administering fluids to Clover while Tom focused on Willow, and together they managed to get both foals to accept more electrolyte solution than Tom had managed alone during the night. "The little one, Willow, you called her?" Ruby asked after they'd finished. "She's really weak. Has she shown any improvement at all?" "Not much. She's swallowing when I give her fluids, but that's about it. Haven't seen her move voluntarily since I found her." Ruby chewed her bottom lip, thinking. "My grandmother had a foal born premature once, about 15 years back. Tiny thing, barely 30 pounds. Everyone said it wouldn't make it, but Gram was stubborn. She tube-fed that baby every 2 hours, kept her wrapped in blankets, basically never left her side for a week. And that horse lived. She's still alive actually, out in Gram's pasture, fat and happy." "What's your point?" "Point is, sometimes the ones that look the worst surprise you. They're fighters in ways that don't always show on the surface." Ruby looked at Willow with an expression of fierce determination. "She's still here, still breathing. That means she's fighting, even if we can't see it." Tom wanted to believe that. The alternative, watching this fragile creature slip away despite his efforts, felt intolerable in a way he didn't want to examine too closely. He'd lost plenty in his life. Loss was the fundamental condition of ranching, of life itself in these harsh places. But something about these foals, about their vulnerability and their complete dependence on his decisions, had gotten under his skin in a way that made objectivity impossible. They worked through the morning, establishing routines that would need to be maintained over the coming days and weeks. Ruby proved invaluable, her movements around the foals confident but never careless, her observations about their condition acute and informed by real experience. She noticed things Tom had missed. The way Clover's ears flicked toward sounds even when her eyes remained unfocused, suggesting her hearing was tracking her surroundings, even if she couldn't yet respond physically. The slight improvement in Ember's coat condition after just one night of hydration, the way the dullness was giving way to something that might eventually shine. Around mid-morning, Ruby made a phone call. Tom heard her speaking in low tones outside the barn, caught fragments about foals and dehydration and could she come today. When Ruby returned, she nodded. "Dr. Morgan will be here around 2. She's got a calving up north but said she'd come straight here after." "What did you tell her about payment?" Ruby met his eyes directly. "Told her the truth, that you found 3 dying foals and pulled them out of a ravine and are trying to save them. She didn't ask about money. She'll come because that's what she does." The simplicity of it made Tom's throat tight. He'd gotten so used to transactions, to the constant calculation of whether he could afford basic necessities, that the idea of someone showing up simply because they were needed felt almost revolutionary. They spent the intervening hours continuing care and preparing the barn for the vet's examination. Ruby proved surprisingly handy, helping Tom reinforce the makeshift stall and set up better lighting. She worked without complaint despite the heat, which was already building toward another punishing afternoon. When they broke for water and a brief rest, she sat on an overturned crate, Kappa's head in her lap, looking at the foals with an expression Tom couldn't quite read. "Can I ask you something?" Ruby said after a while. "Sure. Why did you do it?" "Pull them out, I mean. Most people would have called the county, let them deal with it. No shame in that. But you brought them here to your place knowing what it would cost." Tom considered the question, searching for an answer that made sense. "Honestly, I'm not sure I made a conscious decision. Saw them down in that ravine, saw they were dying, and the rest just happened. My wife, Caroline, she would have done the same thing without thinking twice. Maybe some of her rubbed off on me. She passed 2 years ago. Cancer. By the time they found it, there wasn't much they could do." Ruby nodded slowly, that same complicated expression crossing her face again. "My parents died when I was 11. Car accident on Highway 2 during a snowstorm. That's why I live with Gram now." The information hung between them, a shared geography of loss that needed no elaboration. Tom understood suddenly why this girl had shown up offering help to a stranger. She recognized something in him, in this situation, that resonated with her own understanding of how life could fracture and what it took to keep going afterward. "I'm sorry," Tom said. "Me too. About your wife." Ruby's hand moved absently through Kappa's fur. "But you know what I've learned? Sometimes helping something else survive makes your own survival feel less pointless. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense, more than Tom wanted to admit. He'd been drifting for 2 years, maintaining the bare minimum, going through motions while waiting for some external force to make decisions for him. The bank would foreclose or they wouldn't. The drought would break or it wouldn't. Life would improve or it wouldn't. He'd ceded agency without quite realizing it, letting circumstances dictate terms. But pulling those foals from the ravine had been a choice, a deliberate act of intervention that said some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were terrible and the cost was high. And having made that choice, he'd created obligation, responsibility, purpose. The foals needed him. That simple fact had reorganized something fundamental in how he moved through his days. Dr. Patricia Morgan arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, her truck announcing itself with the distinctive rattle of a vehicle held together through mechanical skill and stubborn refusal to acknowledge obsolescence. She climbed out carrying 2 equipment cases, a woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair cut practically short and the permanently weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors in all seasons. Her eyes, however, were sharp and kind in equal measure. The eyes of someone who'd seen every variety of animal suffering and still showed up to alleviate it. "Ruby," she greeted, then turned to Tom. "Mr. Wallace, heard you've got some patience for me." They led her into the barn, and Dr. Morgan's professional demeanor settled into place like a well-worn coat. She knelt beside the foals, her movements economical and practiced, and began a thorough examination. Tom and Ruby stood back, giving her room to work, watching as she checked vitals, examined gums and eyes, palpated bellies, assessed hydration levels through skin elasticity tests. The examination took nearly 30 minutes. Dr. Morgan worked in focused silence, occasionally making notes on a pad she kept in her shirt pocket. Finally, she sat back and looked at Tom and Ruby. "All right, here's what we're dealing with. The sorrel, Ember you called her, she's responding well. Dehydration is still a concern but improving. She's young and strong, and if we can keep her hydrated and get nutrition into her, I'd say she's got good odds. Maybe 75% chance of full recovery." She moved to Clover. "This gray one is harder to read. Physically, she's in better shape than her condition suggests she should be. But there's something neurological happening, either from the trauma of dehydration or possibly from heat stroke. See how her eyes don't quite focus? That concerns me. She might come out of it as she recovers, or there might be lasting damage. Too early to tell. I'd put her at 50-50. Finally, Dr. Morgan turned to Willow, and her expression grew grave. "This little one, she's critical. Severe dehydration, possible organ involvement, and she's so small she doesn't have the reserves the others do. I can give her subcutaneous fluids, which will help more than oral hydration alone, and I've got some supplements that might stimulate her system. But I'll be honest with you, Mr. Wallace. Her chances are slim. Maybe 20%. The next 48 hours will tell us if she's going to make it." Tom absorbed this, the percentages and qualifications, the careful way Dr. Morgan presented information that acknowledged both possibility and probability. "What do we need to do?" "Round-the-clock monitoring. Fluids every 2 hours, more if they'll take it. I'm leaving you supplies for subcutaneous administration. I'll show you how. Keep them cool but not cold. Watch for any changes, positive or negative, and call me immediately if anything shifts significantly." She paused. Ruby mentioned payment might be an issue. Tom straightened. "I'll pay what I owe. Might take time, but I'm good for it." Dr. Morgan waved this away. "We'll figure it out. Right now, these foals need care, and that's what matters. Send me something when you can. We've all been where you are. The land doesn't make it easy." She spent another hour teaching Tom and Ruby how to administer subcutaneous fluids, showing them how to tent the skin and insert the needle, how to control flow rate, how to recognize if the fluids were absorbing properly. She left behind bags of saline, vitamin supplements, probiotics, and detailed instructions for feeding protocols as the foals improved. As she was loading her truck to leave, Dr. Morgan pulled Tom aside. "You've taken on a significant challenge here. These foals are going to require constant attention, considerable expense, and there's no guarantee of success. Are you prepared for that?" Tom looked back at the barn, where Ruby was already setting up for the next round of fluids. "Prepared? Probably not. But I'm committed. That'll have to be enough." Dr. Morgan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Sometimes that is enough. Call me if you need anything. And Tom, what you're doing here, it matters. Don't let anyone tell you different." She drove away trailing dust, leaving Tom and Ruby to face the reality of the commitment they'd made. The afternoon stretched ahead, hot and demanding, and beyond it lay nights of interrupted sleep and days of relentless care. The bank wouldn't care about foals. The mortgage wouldn't pause for acts of compassion. The drought that had created this crisis in the first place showed no signs of breaking. But in the barn, 3 small lives continued their fragile existence, and for now that was enough to build a purpose around. Tom and Ruby returned to work, and Copper resumed his post at the threshold, and the Montana sun continued its arc across a cloudless sky, indifferent to the small struggles unfolding in the shadow of one aging red barn. The second night brought a different quality of exhaustion. Tom had thought the first night's sleeplessness was the worst it could get, but he'd been operating then on adrenaline and the urgency of immediate crisis. Now, as darkness settled over the barn again, he faced the grinding reality of sustained care with no clear endpoint. His body ached in places he'd forgotten existed, and his eyes burned with a grittiness that no amount of water seemed to wash away. Ruby had stayed through the evening, insisting she could help with the night shift before her grandmother expected her home. They'd established a rotation, one person monitoring the foals while the other rested, switching every 3 hours. It was Ruby's turn to sleep, and she'd curled up on Tom's cot with Copper pressed against her side, both of them dropping into unconsciousness with the absolute commitment of the young and the canine. Tom sat cross-legged on the straw beside the foals, a battery-powered lantern casting yellow light across their small forms. The barn's nighttime sounds had become familiar already. The settling of old wood, the rustle of mice in the rafters, the occasional snort or shift from his remaining cattle in the adjacent section. But underlying everything was the sound he'd become hyper-attuned to, the breathing of 3 foals whose lives depended on his vigilance. Ember had continued her slow improvement throughout the day. She'd managed to stand twice, though each attempt had been shaky and brief, her legs trembling with the effort of supporting even her diminished weight. But the fact that she tried meant something. Her eyes had cleared considerably, tracking movement with genuine interest now rather than the glazed confusion of severe dehydration. When Tom approached with fluids, she nickered softly, a sound so unexpected and sweet it had nearly broken him. He worked with her now, offering electrolyte solution from a bottle with an oversized nipple that Dr. Morgan had provided. Ember latched on with increasing coordination, suckling with a desperation that spoke to returning appetite. Her tail even swished once, a small flag of irritation when he pulled the bottle away to prevent her from drinking too fast. That flash of personality, that assertion of preference and will, felt like a victory worth celebrating. Clover remained the enigma. Physically, she continued stabilizing. Her vital signs were strong, her hydration improving, her body temperature normalizing. But the neurological concerns Dr. Morgan had identified persisted. When Tom moved around her, Clover's eyes followed the motion. But there was a delay, a fractional lag between stimulus and response that suggested something wasn't processing correctly. She accepted fluids passively, swallowing when liquid entered her mouth but showing none of Ember's active participation. Tom had read once, in one of Caroline's horse magazines, about a phenomenon called learned helplessness, where animals subjected to inescapable trauma sometimes shut down internally even after the external threat passed. He wondered if that's what he was seeing in Clover, some psychological withdrawal that had nothing to do with physical damage and everything to do with the overwhelming nature of what she'd experienced. Or maybe Dr. Morgan was right and there was actual neurological injury, cells damaged by heat and dehydration in ways that might never fully heal. Either way, Clover existed in a strange liminal space between present and absent, her body recovering while something essential remained just out of reach. Willow, though. Willow was the one who occupied most of Tom's thoughts during the long stretches of darkness. The tiny cream-colored filly had shown virtually no improvement despite the subcutaneous fluids, the supplements, the constant monitoring. She lay exactly as Tom positioned her, sides rising and falling in shallow breaths that seemed always on the verge of stopping. Her eyes remained closed. Her body felt simultaneously fragile and impossibly heavy, as if gravity were claiming her incrementally. Tom had administered fluids to her just an hour ago, watching the saline create a small bulge under her skin before slowly absorbing. Her body was accepting the hydration at least, processing it on some autonomous level even if her conscious mind remained unreachable. But acceptance wasn't the same as recovery. She was maintaining, hovering in that terrible space where dying hadn't quite completed but living hadn't truly resumed. He placed his hand on her tiny ribcage now, feeling the flutter of her heart beneath his palm. It beat so quickly, a hummingbird rhythm that seemed unsustainable. How long could a heart that size maintain such frantic pace? How much reserve did she have left? "Come on, little girl," Tom murmured, his voice barely audible even in the quiet barn. "I need you to fight. Whatever it takes, wherever you are right now, I need you to find your way back." The words felt foolish even as he spoke them, the kind of anthropomorphic projection that practical ranchers were supposed to avoid. Animals weren't people. They didn't respond to emotional appeals or motivational speeches. They lived or died based on physiology, on whether their bodies possessed the resources necessary for survival. Sentiment didn't enter the equation. But Tom had stopped caring about appearing foolish somewhere around the time he'd climbed down into that ravine. He'd crossed into territory where practical considerations took second place to something more fundamental, some recognition that life, any life, was worth advocating for even when the odds were terrible. A sound from outside the barn pulled his attention. Not close, but distinct enough to register. The yip and howl of coyotes, probably half a mile distant across the prairie. Kappa's head lifted from where he lay beside Ruby, ears pricked forward, a low growl building in his throat. The dog didn't bark, didn't wake Ruby, just issued that warning rumble that said he'd heard and assessed and deemed it not yet worthy of full alarm. Tom stood carefully, joints protesting, and moved to the barn entrance. Through the gap where the sliding door didn't quite close, he could see the prairie night spread vast and star-scattered. The moon had waned to a silver crescent, providing minimal light, but his eyes had adjusted enough to make out the darker shadows of sagebrush against slightly less dark ground. The coyote calls came again, closer now. 3 or 4 distinct voices harmonizing in that eerie yodeling chorus that marked pack communication. They were hunting, probably, working cooperatively to bring down a jackrabbit or maybe a young pronghorn weakened by the drought. The sound carried for miles in the still air, and Tom knew from experience that they weren't as close as they seemed. But their presence reminded him that the barn, for all its shabby protection, was an island of safety in a landscape full of creatures that viewed weakness as opportunity. He thought about the foals lying vulnerable inside and felt a surge of protectiveness so intense it bordered on irrational. They'd survived the ravine, survived dehydration and heat and abandonment. The idea of losing them to predators now, after everything, was intolerable. He checked that the barn door was secure, made sure there were no gaps large enough for anything to slip through, then returned to his vigil. Ruby stirred as he settled back onto the straw, blinking in the lantern light. "What time is it?" "Little past midnight. You've got another hour. Go back to sleep." She sat up anyway, rubbing her eyes. Copper stretched and yawned, his tongue curling impressively. "Heard the coyotes. They close?" "Not close enough to worry about. Just noisy." Ruby stood and moved to check the foals, going through the same assessment Tom had been performing obsessively. Checking breathing, feeling for body temperature, looking for any change in position or response. She spent extra time with Willow, her young face grave in the lamplight. "She's not improving, is she?" Tom saw no point in soft-pedaling reality. "No, she's not getting worse, but she's not coming back either. It's like she's stuck somewhere between." Ruby sat beside Willow, one hand resting gently on the filly's neck. My grandmother says sometimes the smallest ones have to fight the hardest, and that takes time we can't see. Like they're doing all this internal work while we're waiting for external signs. You believe that? I want to. Ruby looked up at him, and in her eyes Tom saw that particular brand of desperate hope that comes from having already lost too much. Because if I don't believe she can come back, then what's the point of any of this? It was a fair question and one Tom had been avoiding asking himself. What was the point? 3 foals, 2 recovering and 1 fading. In a barn owned by a man facing foreclosure, cared for by a widower and a teenage girl who both had their own grief to carry. The practical answer was that there was no point, that this was resource allocation at its most irrational sentiment masquerading as purpose. But sitting there in the small circle of lamplight, watching Ruby's hand make small soothing circles on Willow's neck, Tom recognized something that transcended practicality. The point wasn't outcome. The point was the act itself, the decision to try when trying was difficult and success was uncertain. The point was refusing to let suffering go unwitnessed and unaddressed, even when addressing it cost more than you could afford. The point, Tom said slowly, is that she matters. They all matter. And maybe that's enough. Ruby nodded, and they sat together in companionable silence, 2 people keeping vigil over fragile lives, while the night deepened around them. Copper eventually padded over and settled between them, his warmth and solid presence a comfort. The coyotes called again, more distant now, their voices fading as they moved on to other hunting grounds. Around 2 in the morning, during what was supposed to be Tom's rest period, but which he spent sleepless on the cot, something changed. He couldn't have said what alerted him initially, some subliminal shift in the quality of sound or air. But he was suddenly fully awake, moving toward the stall before conscious thought caught up with instinct. Ruby had been dozing sitting up, her back against the wall, but she stirred as Tom approached. What's wrong? Not sure. Something felt different. They both looked at the foals. Ember was sleeping, her breathing deep and even, the sleep of genuine rest rather than unconsciousness. Clover's eyes were open, reflecting lamplight, that same unfocused quality making her appear more absent than present. But Willow had shifted position. It was a small thing barely noticeable. Her head had moved perhaps 2 inches from where it had been, angled slightly differently against the straw. But Tom knew with absolute certainty that he hadn't repositioned her, and Ruby had been dozing, which meant Willow had moved herself, the first voluntary movement she'd made since being pulled from the ravine. Tom knelt beside her, hardly daring to breathe. Willow, can you hear me, girl? The filly's eyelids fluttered, not opening but definitely responding to stimulus. Her nostrils flared slightly, processing sense. A tremor ran through her body, barely perceptible but unmistakable. She was there, somewhere behind that fragile mask of unconsciousness, fighting her way back. Ruby grabbed Tom's arm, her grip tight with excitement. She moved. I saw it. She actually moved. Easy. Don't get hopes up too high. Could be just a reflex. But even as he said it, Tom felt that dangerous flutter of optimism he'd been trying to suppress. Movement meant neural activity. It meant her brain was processing signals and her muscles were responding. It wasn't recovery, not yet, but it was the first real evidence that recovery might be possible. They stayed with Willow for the next hour, watching for any other signs of change. Nothing as dramatic as that initial movement occurred, but Tom thought, maybe, that her breathing had deepened slightly, become less frantic and more measured. Or maybe he was seeing what he wanted to see, imposing patterns on random variation. The mind did that when stakes were high, found meaning in chaos because meaninglessness was harder to accept. By the time dawn began its slow infiltration of the barn's interior, both Tom and Ruby were running on fumes. They'd abandoned any pretense of sleep rotation, instead sitting together watching the foals as night gave way to day. The transformation of light from lantern yellow to the cold blue-gray of pre-dawn to the warmer tones of sunrise felt symbolic somehow, as if the world itself were offering evidence of change and renewal. Ember woke with the dawn, struggling to her feet with determination that hadn't been present the day before. She stood swaying for a long moment, legs braced wide, then took 3 tentative steps before her strength gave out and she folded back onto the straw. But those 3 steps represented more progress than 100 improvements in vital signs. She was mobile. She was trying to engage with her environment rather than simply enduring it. Ruby prepared bottles while Tom checked each foal's hydration status. Clover accepted her feeding mechanically, but when Tom ran his hand down her neck afterward, her ear flicked toward him. A small thing easily missed, but it represented awareness of his presence. She was tracking the world around her, even if she couldn't yet fully interact with it. Willow remained the great unknown. Her slight movement during the night hadn't repeated, and in the harsh clarity of morning light, Tom second-guessed whether he'd actually seen it or imagined it. She looked no different than she had 24 hours ago. Small, fragile, barely there. But she was still breathing, still processing the fluids they administered, still occupying that liminal space between life and death. Ruby's grandmother called around 7, her voice tinny through Ruby's phone speaker. The girl stepped outside to take the call, and Tom could hear the murmur of conversation through the barn walls. When Ruby returned, her expression was complicated. "Gram needs me home for a few hours. She's got a doctor's appointment in town and I need to drive her. But I'll be back this afternoon if that's okay." "Of course. You've already done more than I had any right to ask." Ruby shook her head. "You didn't ask. I offered. There's a difference." She gathered her things, then paused at the barn entrance. "Tom, what you said last night about the matching, I think that's true. But I also think maybe we matter too. Maybe taking care of them is also taking care of something in us that needs it." She left before Tom could formulate a response, her truck disappearing down the access road in a plume of dust that caught the morning light. Tom stood watching until the dust settled, then turned back to the barn and the day's work that stretched ahead. The morning routine consumed several hours, administering fluids, checking vital signs, cleaning the stall area, ensuring the foals had adequate ventilation without direct exposure to the building heat. Tom's cattle needed attention too, which he'd been neglecting in favor of the foals. He hauled water to their tank, checked their condition, moved them to a slightly better patch of surviving grass. The work was familiar, almost meditative, and it gave his mind space to process everything that had happened in the past 2 days. When he returned to the barn, he found Copper sitting at attention, staring at Willow with an intensity that made Tom's heart rate spike. He moved quickly to the stall, expecting the worst, and instead found something he hadn't dared hope for. Willow's eyes were open. They were unfocused, glassy with confusion and weakness, but they were open. Her head remained flat against the straw, and she made no attempt to move, but her eyes tracked slowly across the limited field of her vision. She was conscious, aware, present in a way she hadn't been since he'd pulled her from that ravine. Tom knelt beside her, speaking softly. "There you are. Wondered if we'd lost you." Willow's eyes found his face and held there for a heartbeat before sliding away. The effort of focusing seemed to exhaust her, and her eyelids drooped, but they didn't quite close. She was fighting to stay, aware, fighting to maintain this fragile connection to the waking world. Tom prepared a syringe of electrolyte solution with hands that trembled slightly. When he brought it to Willow's mouth, her lips parted. Not much, barely perceptible, but it was an active response rather than passive acceptance. She wanted the liquid. Her body was telling her brain that it needed hydration, and her brain was capable of processing that signal and initiating appropriate response. The amount she took was minimal, maybe 2 ounces, but she swallowed each bit deliberately. When Tom pulled the syringe away to give her a rest, Willow made a sound, barely audible, something between a sigh and a whimper. It was the first vocalization he'd heard from her, and it hit him with unexpected force. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it's hard, but you're doing it. You're coming back." He spent the next hour with Willow, offering small amounts of fluid every 10 minutes, speaking to her constantly in that low, steady voice. Her eyes closed again eventually, but this time it read as sleep rather than unconsciousness. Her breathing had definitely deepened, become more regular. The frantic hummingbird quality had eased into something that suggested rest rather than crisis. When Ruby returned in the early afternoon, Tom was still sitting with Willow. He looked up at the sound of footsteps and saw Ruby's face transform when she registered what she was seeing. She's awake. She's sleeping now, but it's different. Real sleep, and she took fluids on her own, showed active interest in drinking. Ruby dropped to her knees beside the stall, her hands pressed to her mouth, and Tom saw tears gathering in her eyes. I knew it. I knew she'd come back. Graham always says the fighters find a way. She's not out of danger yet. This could be temporary improvement before decline. Dr. Morgan warned about that, the way bodies sometimes rally before giving up. Don't. Ruby's voice was fierce. Don't do that. Don't protect yourself by expecting the worst. Let yourself believe she might make it. Tom wanted to argue, wanted to explain that hope was dangerous precisely because it made disappointment devastating. But looking at Ruby's young face, at the fierce certainty there, he recognized that she'd already learned what he was trying to protect himself from. She'd lost her parents. She knew about hope crushed and futures canceled. And still she chose to believe this small cream-colored filly might survive. Maybe that was the braver choice. Maybe refusing to be defeated by probability was its own form of strength. All right, Tom said. We'll believe she's going to make it. Ruby smiled, and for a moment the worry and exhaustion that had lined her face disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like joy. They sat together watching Willow breathe, watching Ember explore the stall with increasing confidence, watching Clover's ears track sounds even while her eyes remained unfocused. Outside, the afternoon sun hammered down on drought-stricken land. Somewhere in the distance, Tom's cattle lowed, and farther still, the prairie stretched empty and brown toward horizons that promised nothing but more of the same. The bank's letters waited in their shoebox, each one a countdown toward inevitable loss. The future remained as uncertain as it had been yesterday, as precarious and undefined. But in the barn, 3 foals breathed and rested and fought their way back toward life. And 2 people kept vigil over them, choosing to believe that sometimes, despite everything, the smallest and most fragile things found the strength to survive. It wasn't much to build hope on, but for now, sitting in the dusty light with Copper warm against his leg and Ruby humming something tuneless beside him, Tom thought maybe it was enough. The third morning arrived with a quality of light that seemed almost accusatory in its clarity. Tom woke to find himself still in the stall, his back against the rough wood wall, every muscle in his body staging a formal protest against the accommodations. Ruby had gone home around midnight, promising to return at dawn, and in the intervening hours Tom had maintained his solitary watch over the foals with only Copper for company. He pushed himself upright with a groan that would have embarrassed him if anyone had been there to hear it. The barn's interior was still relatively cool. That brief window before the sun reasserted its dominance and turned the structure into an oven. Through the gaps in the walls, morning light slanted in dusty columns, illuminating particles that danced and swirled with each movement of air. Ember was already awake, standing on legs that looked marginally steadier than yesterday. The sorrel filly had her nose pressed against the stall partition, nostrils working overtime to process the smells of morning. Hay and dust, animal warmth, the faint petroleum scent of the lantern that had burned through the night. When she noticed Tom watching, she nickered, a sound that carried equal parts greeting and demand. "Good morning to you too," Tom muttered, reaching for the bottles he'd prepared before falling asleep. His hands moved through the routine with increasing automaticity. Check temperature, assess consistency, approach slowly so as not to startle. Ember latched onto the nipple with an enthusiasm that nearly pulled the bottle from his grip, suckling so aggressively that Tom had to pull back several times to prevent her from drinking too fast. "Easy there. It's not going anywhere." But Ember's desperation spoke to something positive. Her appetite had returned in force, her body demanding the nutrition it needed to fuel recovery. She'd gained subtle weight over the past 2 days, her ribs less prominent, her coat beginning to show hints of the luster that dehydration had stolen. When she finished the bottle, she butted her head against Tom's chest, clearly asking for more. "That's all for now. Too much at once and you'll make yourself sick." The filly snorted her displeasure but didn't push further. Instead, she turned her attention to exploring the stall, nosing through the straw, investigating the water bucket Tom had set up, generally behaving like a young horse discovering the world rather than a creature that had been hours from death just days ago. The transformation was remarkable enough to kindle something dangerous in Tom's chest. Optimism that extended beyond the immediate moment. Clover presented a more complex picture. The dappled gray filly had physically stabilized to the point where her vital signs were almost normal. She ate mechanically when offered bottles, her body processing nutrition efficiently. But the neurological disconnect Dr. Morgan had identified persisted. Clover's eyes remained unfocused, her responses to external stimuli delayed and incomplete. She existed in her body without seeming fully present within it. Tom had watched Caroline fade in a similar way during her final weeks, the cancer medications creating a cognitive fog that left her physically present but mentally distant. She'd look at him sometimes without quite seeing him, would respond to questions several beats after they were asked, as if the words had to travel through deep water to reach whatever part of her was still fighting. The memory sat heavy in his chest as he watched Clover's eyes track his movement with that same fractional delay. "Where are you?" he asked quietly, running his hand along her neck. "What's keeping you locked away in there?" Clover's ear flicked toward his voice, but her expression remained vacant. Tom had researched equine neurological issues on his ancient laptop the previous evening, reading medical terminology that mostly served to confirm what he already understood. Brain injuries in horses were unpredictable, treatment options limited, outcomes ranging from complete recovery to permanent disability. The articles used phrases like wait and see and only time will tell, the frustrating language of medicine confronting the limits of its knowledge. But Willow, the smallest and most critical of the three, had continued her improbable rally. Tom moved to check on her and found the cream-colored filly with her eyes open again, head lifted perhaps 2 inches off the straw. It wasn't much, but it represented significant muscular effort for an animal that had barely moved in days. Her eyes found Tom's face and held there, clear and present in a way they hadn't been before. "Morning, little girl. You decided to stick around after all." Willow's nostrils flared, processing his scent. When he offered the bottle, she latched on with surprising strength, drinking steadily for nearly a minute before her energy flagged and she released the nipple. Her head lowered back to the straw, but slowly, controlled, rather than the collapse of complete exhaustion. Tom sat beside her, one hand resting lightly on her ribcage, feeling the steady thump of her heart. It had slowed from that frantic hummingbird pace, settling into a rhythm that suggested her body was no longer in crisis mode. The change was subtle but significant, the difference between a system in emergency override and one beginning to stabilize. The sound of a vehicle approaching pulled Tom's attention. He checked his watch, surprised to find it was barely past 6. Too early for Ruby to be returning, and he wasn't expecting Dr. Morgan for another day. He stood and moved to the barn entrance, Copper materializing at his side with the instantaneous alertness of a good working dog. A county sheriff's vehicle rolled to a stop in the yard, dust settling around it like commentary. Deputy James Crawford climbed out, a man in his early 40s with the build of someone who'd been athletic in high school and hadn't quite accepted that those days were past. He wore his uniform with a precision that suggested he took the authority it represented very seriously. "Morning, Tom." Crawford's tone was professional but not warm. "Got a minute?" "Seems like I do. What brings you out this early?" Crawford approached with measured steps, his eyes scanning the property with practiced assessment. "Had a call yesterday from someone reporting possible animal welfare issues at your place. Said you'd taken in wild horses without proper facilities or permits." Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Who made the report?" "Can't disclose that, but the complaint was specific enough that I need to follow up. Mind if I take a look at what you've got?" There was no refusing without making things worse. Tom gestured toward the barn. 3 foals I pulled out of a dry creek bed 3 days ago. They were dying. Still might, the smallest one especially. Dr. Morgan's been out, we're providing round-the-clock care. Crawford followed Tom into the barn, and to his credit, His expression shifted when he saw the foals. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't this makeshift intensive care setup. The clean straw, the organized supplies, the evidence of sustained effort and attention. Ember looked up at the newcomer with curious interest. Clover didn't register his presence. Willow watched with those large, clear eyes that seemed to hold more awareness than her fragile body should be capable of generating. "These are the animals in question?" Crawford pulled out a small notebook, his voice losing some of its official edge. "They are. Found them trapped in a ravine down by Willow Creek. No sign of their mothers. They would have died if I hadn't pulled them out." Crawford knelt beside the stall, his examination quick but thorough. Tom could see him processing what he observed. The foals' improving condition, the medical supplies, the obvious investment of resources and care. Whatever complaint had been filed, it wasn't supported by the evidence in front of him. "You got documentation of Dr. Morgan's involvement? She left detailed care instructions, supply lists. Can show you all of it." "That'll help." Crawford stood, brushing straw from his knees. "Look, Tom, between us, this complaint seems more about someone having an issue with you than legitimate welfare concerns. These foals are receiving better care than half the horses in the county. But officially, I need to document everything, submit a report. You understand?" Tom understood perfectly. Someone, probably someone who knew about his financial situation, had decided to make trouble. Maybe they thought they were helping by trying to get the foals transferred to county care. Or maybe they just enjoyed watching a struggling man accumulate more problems. Rural communities could be supportive or punitive, often depending on factors that had nothing to do with the situation at hand. "Do what you need to do," Tom said. "I've got nothing to hide. These foals are getting everything they need, and more than I can really afford if I'm being honest. But that's my choice to make." Crawford spent another 20 minutes documenting the setup, taking photos, reviewing the care protocols Dr. Morgan had provided. His questions were thorough but not hostile, and by the end Tom sensed the deputy's report would be favorable. Still, the interruption had injected new tension into an already stressful situation. After Crawford left, Tom stood in the barn doorway watching the dust settle from the departing vehicle. Copper leaned against his leg, and Tom's hand found the dog's head, fingers working through coarse fur in a gesture more for his own comfort than the animal's. "Who do you think called it in?" Ruby's voice came from behind him. Tom turned to find her standing in the barn, though he hadn't heard her truck arrive. She must have pulled up while he was dealing with Crawford. Could be anyone. Could be someone who legitimately thinks I'm in over my head and the foals would be better off in official care. Could be someone who doesn't like how I'm handling my property. Hard to say. Ruby's expression darkened. "People need to mind their own business. You're doing everything right. Doesn't matter if I'm doing everything right. If I can't afford to keep doing it." Tom hadn't meant to say it out loud, hadn't meant to acknowledge the mathematics that kept cycling through his head during sleepless hours. But Ruby deserved honesty, had earned it through her commitment over the past days. "What do you mean?" Tom gestured back toward the barn. "Feed, supplies, vet bills. I'm burning through what little money I had saved. The bank's already threatening foreclosure, and this isn't helping. At some point, wanting to help isn't enough if you don't have the means." Ruby was quiet for a long moment, her young face troubled. "What will happen to them? To the foals, I mean, if you can't keep them here? County would probably take them. They've got facilities, resources I don't have. The foals would be fine eventually." Tom heard the hollowness in his own voice, the way he was trying to convince himself as much as Ruby. "But you don't want that. What I want doesn't change the reality of the situation." Ruby crossed her arms, that fierce expression returning. "My grandmother always says reality is what you make of it, not what it makes of you. Maybe there's a way to make this work that you haven't thought of." Before Tom could respond, a sound from inside the barn demanded their attention. Ember, making a commotion that suggested either excitement or distress. They both moved quickly, finding the sorrel filly standing at the stall entrance, body pressed against the partition, nostrils flared and ears pricked forward with intense focus. She was looking toward the barn's far end, where the large doors opened onto the back pasture. Following her gaze, Tom saw nothing initially, just the morning light streaming through gaps in the weathered boards. But Copper had gone rigid, a low growl building in his throat, and that was never a good sign. Tom moved cautiously toward the back of the barn, Ruby close behind. As they approached the doors, a sound reached them, faint but unmistakable, hoofbeats. Not the erratic clatter of loose horses, but something measured and purposeful, growing steadily louder. "Stay here," Tom instructed Ruby, though he wasn't sure what he was protecting her from. He unlatched one of the back doors and pulled it open carefully, morning light flooding the barn's dim interior. What he saw stopped him completely. A mare stood perhaps 50 yards away, at the edge of where the dried creek bed met his property. She was wild, that much was immediately obvious from her bearing and the way she held herself at the threshold between approach and flight. Her coat was a dusty bay, darkened with dirt and the evidence of hard living. She was thin, ribs visible even at this distance, but she carried herself with undeniable presence. But what arrested Tom's attention was the way she was focused on the barn, ears forward, nostrils working to process every scent, every sound. She took 3 steps closer, paused, took 2 more. Her posture radiated something between desperation and determination, as if she were simultaneously terrified and unable to stop herself from approaching. Behind Tom, inside the barn, all 3 foals had gone silent and still. Then Ember nickered, high and piercing, a sound Tom had never heard her make before. It was answered immediately by the mare, a call that resonated with such emotional intensity it raised the hair on Tom's arms. Ruby appeared at his shoulder, her hand finding his arm. "Tom," she whispered, "that's their mother. That's got to be their mother." The mare called again, and this time Clover responded, her voice weak but present, the first vocalization Tom had heard from the gray filly. Even Willow made a sound, barely audible but unmistakable. The foals knew this mare, recognized her in some fundamental way that transcended their compromised states. Tom's mind raced through implications. If this was their mother, where had she been? Why had she left them? And more pressingly, what did her return mean for the fragile stability they'd established? The mare took several more steps forward, closing the distance by half. She was limping, Tom noticed, favoring her right front leg. Her coat bore evidence of recent injury, scrapes and small wounds that suggested encounters with barbed wire or rough terrain. She looked like she'd been through her own ordeal, had survived something that by all rights should have killed her. "Easy," Tom said, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the mare, to Ruby, or to himself. "Let her come if she's going to come." They stood motionless as the mare continued her approach, each step a negotiation between fear and need. When she was 20 yards out, Tom could see her ribs expanding with each breath, could see the way her ears kept swiveling between the barn and her surroundings, monitoring for threats while being drawn inexorably toward the sound of her offspring. 15 yards. 10. And then she stopped, standing in the yard with morning sun illuminating every line of exhaustion and determination in her frame. Up close, she was simultaneously magnificent and devastated, a creature that embodied both the wild freedom of open range and the terrible cost of survival in harsh country. Ember nickered again from inside the barn, and the mare's response was immediate and visceral, a mother's call that seemed to contain everything: grief and relief, fear and fierce protectiveness. She took 3 more steps, close enough now that Tom could see her eyes, could see the intelligence and desperation there. "Ruby," Tom said quietly, "go very slowly and open the stall. Let Ember come out if she wants." Ruby moved with careful deliberation, unlatching the stall partition and stepping back. Ember didn't hesitate. The filly pushed through the opening and stumbled toward the barn entrance, legs still unsteady but driven by something more powerful than physical limitation. She passed between Tom and Ruby like they weren't there, focused entirely on the mare standing in the yard. Mother and daughter met in the middle of that dusty space between barn and dried creek, and the sound they made together was something Tom knew he'd remember for the rest of his life. The mare nosed Ember frantically, running her muzzle over the filly's body, checking for injuries, reassuring herself that this was real. Ember pressed against her mother's side, making small sounds of distress and comfort mixed together. "Should we bring the others out?" Ruby asked, her voice thick with emotion. Tom considered. Clover was mobile enough, but Willow remained critically weak. "Let's get Clover. But Willow stays inside for now. She's not strong enough." They brought the gray filly out carefully, supporting her weight between them. The mare saw them and tensed, ears pinning back. But when Clover called out weakly, the mare's aggression disappeared, replaced by that same desperate maternal focus. She moved to meet them, and when they released Clover, the filly stumbled to her mother with single-minded determination. The mare divided her attention between her two recovered daughters, nickering constantly, checking them over with thorough intensity. But she kept looking toward the barn, kept calling, and Tom understood she knew there was a third foal still inside. "We can't bring Willow out," Tom said, speaking to the mare as if she might understand. "She's too weak. She wouldn't survive the stress." The mare called again, her frustration and distress evident. She tried to move toward the barn, but her injured leg made her stumble, and pain flashed across her face in a way that was heartbreakingly human in its expression. Ruby grabbed Tom's arm. "We need to let her inside. She needs to see Willow, and Willow needs her mother. It might be what helps her pull through completely." Tom knew Ruby was right, but the logistics were daunting. A wild mare inside the barn was a recipe for chaos, potential injury for everyone involved. But looking at the desperate mother calling for her missing baby, at Ember and Clover pressed against her sides, he knew there was only one choice that honored what these animals had survived. "All right, but slowly. We give her space, don't corner her, and if she panics we back off immediately." They positioned themselves carefully, creating a corridor between the mare and the barn entrance. Tom spoke in low, steady tones, the same voice he'd used with the foals for days now, telling the mare she was safe, that her baby was inside, that they meant no harm. The mare's ears flicked forward, listening, assessing. She took one hesitant step toward the barn, then another. Ember and Clover followed, flanking their mother like escorts. The small procession moved slowly across the yard, the mare limping badly but determined, the foals weak but driven by reunion. Copper watched from a safe distance, his instincts as a herding dog warring with his recognition that this situation required stillness rather than action. When the mare reached the barn entrance, she paused, looking into the dim interior with obvious trepidation. Wild horses didn't enter enclosed spaces voluntarily. Every instinct would be telling her this was a trap, that stepping inside meant losing her ability to flee. But her baby was in there, and that need overrode millions of years of evolutionary caution. She entered slowly, Ember and Clover pressing close. Tom and Ruby followed at a distance, giving her space. The mare moved through the barn with her head high, nostrils flaring, taking in every sight and scent. When she reached the stall where Willow lay, she stopped completely. The tiny cream-colored filly had her head raised, eyes fixed on her mother with an intensity that belied her physical weakness. She tried to stand, legs scrambling in the straw, but lacked the strength. A sound came from her, thin and desperate, the cry of a baby who'd given up hope of rescue and suddenly found it restored. The mare pushed into the stall, her size making the space seem suddenly cramped. She lowered her head to Willow, and the reunion that followed was almost too intimate to witness. The mare nickered constantly, running her muzzle over every inch of her smallest baby, checking her condition, offering reassurance. Willow pressed her face against her mother's chest, breathing in the scent she'd been separated from, drawing strength from the solid presence that meant safety and survival. Tom felt Ruby's hand find his, her grip tight. They stood together watching, both of them understanding they were witnessing something rare and profound. A family reunited against improbable odds, a mother who'd somehow found her way back to babies that by all logic should have died before she could reach them. The mare settled into the straw beside Willow, positioning her body as a windbreak and support. Ember and Clover crowded in, All 4 horses pressed together in a tangle of legs and bodies that spoke to their need for physical connection. The mare's exhaustion was evident now that the urgency had passed. She'd been searching, traveling, pushing herself past reasonable limits to find her offspring. Now that she had them, her body's demands for rest couldn't be ignored any longer. Tom and Ruby backed away slowly, giving the family space. Outside the stall, they looked at each other, both struggling with the emotional weight of what they'd just witnessed. "What do we do now?" Ruby asked. It was the right question, and Tom didn't have a good answer. The mare's presence changed everything. She wasn't critically dehydrated like the foals had been, but she was injured, exhausted, and clearly had her own story of survival. She needed care, but she was wild, which complicated every aspect of providing that care. And beyond the immediate logistics loomed the larger question. What happened next? Dr. Morgan arrived an hour later in response to Tom's call. She assessed the situation with her characteristic blend of professional competence and quiet amazement. The mare allowed examination once she understood no one was trying to separate her from her foals, and Dr. Morgan's findings confirmed what Tom had observed. Lacerations from barbed wire, severe dehydration though less critical than the foals had been, and a partially torn ligament in her right front leg that explained the limp. "This mare has been through something significant," Dr. Morgan said as she worked, administering antibiotics and wrapping the injured leg. "These wire cuts are at least a week old, partially healed. My guess is she got tangled in a fence somewhere, fought her way free, and has been searching for her foals ever since." "How did they get separated in the first place?" Ruby asked. Dr. Morgan shook her head. "Could be anything. Predator attack that scattered them, human intervention, drought pushing them into unfamiliar territory where they got split up. With wild horses, we'll never know the full story. What matters is she found them, and against all probability, they survived long enough for that reunion to happen." She finished her examination and began packing her supplies. "Tom, this changes the care protocol significantly. The mare can nurse the foals, which will help their recovery immensely. But she needs nutrition herself, and that leg needs time to heal. We're looking at several weeks minimum before she should be moving much." Tom nodded, already calculating costs he couldn't afford and logistics that made his head hurt. Dr. Morgan seemed to read his thoughts. "I'm not worried about payment right now. Let's focus on getting all 4 of them stable. The rest we can figure out later." After she left, Tom sat on his customary overturned bucket, watching the reunited family rest in the stall. The mare had positioned herself so Willow could nurse, and the tiny filly was latched on with determination, drawing nourishment from the one source perfectly designed to provide it. Ember and Clover rested against their mother's flanks, the 3 foals creating a small fortress of family around the mare who'd refused to abandon them. Ruby had gone home to update her grandmother and get more supplies, promising to return before evening. The barn was quiet except for the sounds of equine breathing and the occasional soft nicker as one of the foals shifted position. Copper lay across the barn entrance, maintaining his vigil despite the reduced threat level now that mother and babies were reunited. Tom's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. A text from an unknown number. "Heard you got quite a setup going. Still won't make the mortgage payment though. Just delaying the inevitable." He stared at the message, feeling the familiar weight of financial reality pressing down. The anonymous sender was right. Taking care of these horses, as noble as it might be, didn't change the mathematics of his situation. The bank didn't care about wild horses or reunited families or the moral implications of letting vulnerable creatures die when you had the means to help them. The bank cared about payments, deadlines, and the bottom line that said Tom Wallace was out of options. He could call the county, turn all 4 horses over to their care. They had facilities, funding, expertise. The horses would be fine, probably better than fine. It was the rational choice, the one that acknowledged he couldn't save everything and trying would only lead to losing what little he had left. But watching the mare sleep with her foals pressed against her, seeing Willow nurse with strength she hadn't possessed hours ago, Tom knew he wouldn't make that call. Not today. Maybe not ever. Some choices couldn't be justified by rational analysis. Some things were worth fighting for even when the fight was probably futile. He stood, joints protesting, and moved to check the water supply. There was work to do, care to provide. A small family that needed him to keep showing up despite exhaustion and doubt and the mathematical certainty of eventual defeat. The barn smelled of hay and horses and the particular sweetness of manure from animals whose bodies were processing nutrition again. Morning had given way to the fierce heat of afternoon, but inside the barn the air remained almost cool. Tom filled water buckets, spread fresh straw, organized supplies for the evening feeding schedule. Copper followed him from task to task, the dog's presence a reminder that loyalty didn't require justification or guarantee of positive outcome. Sometimes you kept showing up simply because that's what you did when something depended on you. Evening came eventually, as it always did. Ruby returned with her grandmother, a weathered woman in her 70s who moved with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain. She stood at the stall entrance for a long time, just watching the horses, before speaking. "Tom Wallace, you've got yourself quite a situation here." "Yes, ma'am, that I do. My granddaughter tells me you're running out of money to care for them. That true?" Tom saw no point in denying it. "Yes, ma'am." The old woman nodded slowly. "Also tells me you're not planning to stop trying. That true too?" "Can't seem to make myself do otherwise." She smiled, the expression transforming her lined face. "Then I guess we'll have to figure something out. Can't have a man with enough heart to pull dying foals from a ravine lose everything for doing the right thing. Ruby, start making calls to the feed store, the vet supply, and that woman from the horse rescue over in Billings. Time to see who else wants to be part of keeping this family together." Tom started to protest, to explain that he couldn't accept charity. But the old woman held up a hand. "This isn't charity. This is community recognizing when one of their own needs support. You helped these horses when no one else would. Now we help you. That's how it works when people remember what matters." In the stall, the mare lifted her head and nickered softly, and all three foals responded with their own small sounds. Outside, the sun was setting over drought-stricken land, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose. The future remained uncertain, the challenges significant, the odds still probably against them. But in that moment, standing in the barn with Ruby and her grandmother, watching a wild mare nurse her foals back to health, Tom felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe the foundation hope could build on. The recognition that sometimes the impossible happened, and sometimes help appeared from unexpected sources, and sometimes choosing to care despite the cost was exactly the right decision even when every rational analysis said otherwise. The mare's eyes found his across the stall, and in them Tom saw his own stubborn refusal to surrender reflected back. They'd both survived things that should have broken them. They'd both found reasons to keep fighting when fighting seemed futile. And now their paths had converged in this ramshackle barn on the edge of foreclosure, creating something neither could have managed alone. A chance for all of them to make it through to whatever came next. Tom nodded to the mare, a gesture of recognition and commitment. She held his gaze for a long moment, then lowered her head back to her resting foals. The barn settled into evening quiet, full of breath and warmth and the improbable persistence of life in hard places. 3 weeks had transformed the barn from a makeshift emergency ward into something that felt almost permanent. The mare, whom Ruby had named Storm for the weather that had separated her from her foals, had regained much of her strength. Her coat had lost its dull, dusty appearance and now gleamed with the deep bay richness that spoke of proper nutrition and care. The limp had diminished to a slight favoring of her right leg, noticeable only when she moved quickly. The foals had grown in ways that seemed almost magical to Tom. Ember was now robust and energetic, spending her days alternating between nursing, exploring every corner of the barn, and attempting to convince Copper to play with her. The sorrel filly had developed a personality that could only be described as bold, investigating everything with fearless curiosity that occasionally required intervention when she tried to chew on tools or squeeze through gaps she couldn't fit through. Clover remained the puzzle. Her physical recovery had been complete for over a week, her body showing no lingering effects from the dehydration and heat exposure that had nearly killed her. But the neurological disconnect persisted, though it had evolved into something different than the vacant, unfocused state of those first days. She responded to stimuli now, ate enthusiastically, moved with coordination. But there was a quality to her awareness that suggested she existed slightly apart from the world around her, processing everything through some invisible filter that created a perpetual delay between experience and response. Dr. Morgan had examined her twice more, conducting tests that revealed no obvious physical damage. Her best hypothesis was that the trauma had created something closer to a psychological response than a neurological injury, a protective withdrawal that Clover might or might not fully emerge from. In the meantime, she functioned well enough, staying close to Storm and her sisters, participating in their daily routines with a dreamy quality that made her seem perpetually half asleep. Willow's recovery had been the most dramatic and the most complete. The tiny cream-colored filly who'd been hours from death had not only survived but thrived. She'd gained weight rapidly once Storm's milk became available, her ribs disappearing under healthy flesh, her coat taking on a luminous quality that made her look almost ethereal. She remained the smallest of the three, and probably always would be, but her spirit had proven larger than her physical form suggested. Tom had watched her personality emerge over the weeks with something approaching wonder. Willow was gentle and observant, spending long periods simply watching the world around her with those large, intelligent eyes. But she was also determined in ways that manifested unexpectedly. When Ember would push her away from the best nursing position, Willow would wait patiently and then maneuver her way back with quiet persistence. When something frightened her, she'd retreat only momentarily before approaching again, curiosity overcoming caution. The community response that Ruby's grandmother had initiated had exceeded anything Tom could have imagined. The feed store had donated grain and hay, enough to support 4 horses through the worst of the drought. The vet supply company had provided supplements at cost, and Dr. Morgan had continued to defer payment while submitting Tom's situation to an animal welfare grant that might cover some of the expenses. Even the bank, when contacted by several prominent community members, had agreed to a 3-month extension on foreclosure proceedings. But perhaps more valuable than the material support was the steady stream of visitors who'd started appearing at the barn. Neighbors Tom barely knew would stop by with carrots or apples for the horses, would stay to help with chores or simply to watch Storm and her foals interact. Ruby's grandmother came several times a week, sharing stories about horses she'd raised and offering advice that came from decades of experience. The barn had become something more than Tom's makeshift home. It had become a gathering place, a location where people came to witness something that felt like proof that persistence mattered, that care and effort could produce miracles, that the worst circumstances didn't always produce the worst outcomes. Deputy Crawford had returned once, officially closing his investigation with a report that praised the level of care being provided. He'd stood watching the horses for nearly 20 minutes, a slight smile on his face, before telling Tom that whoever had filed the complaint had done him a favor by forcing documentation of what was happening here. Now, as Tom stood in the barn entrance watching the evening light paint everything in shades of amber, he felt the accumulated weight of those 3 weeks settling into something like contentment. Storm stood in the center of the stall, her 3 daughters arranged around her in the configuration they seemed to prefer. Ember at her front where she could nose at her mother's face, Clover at her side pressed close, and Willow tucked against her flank where the smallest filly felt most secure. Ruby approached from where she'd been filling water buckets, wiping her hands on her jeans. She'd become a fixture at the barn, arriving early most mornings and staying late, her summer transformed by this unexpected purpose. In a few days, school would start, and her time here would become limited to afternoons and weekends. They'd been planning for that transition, working out schedules that would allow Tom to manage alone, when necessary, while ensuring the horses continued receiving optimal care. Graham wants to know if you'd consider letting Storm and the foals move to her property once they're fully recovered, Ruby said without preamble. She's got 30 acres with good pasture, proper fencing, a shelter. Says she's been missing having horses around since her arthritis got too bad to manage them alone. But with me to help and you nearby if we need advice, she thinks it could work. Tom had been expecting this conversation or something like it. Storm was wild, and keeping a wild horse long-term on property that wasn't set up for it presented ongoing challenges. The foals, born wild, would always carry that independence in their blood. They needed space to run, to be horses in ways that his small converted barn and drought-stricken acreage couldn't really provide. "What do you think?" Tom asked. Ruby's expression was complicated. "I think they'd be happy there. Graham's land still has water from a spring-fed pond, and the grass is better. Storm could heal completely, and the foals would have room to grow up proper. But I also think you'd miss them, and they'd miss you." It was true. Tom had bonded with these horses in ways he hadn't anticipated, had come to organize his days around their needs and find meaning in their small victories. The idea of the barn returning to its former emptiness, of mornings without Ember's demanding knickers or evenings without watching Willow's quiet observations, felt like another kind of loss. But this had never been about him. It had been about giving 4 desperate creatures a chance at survival, and survival meant more than just not dying. It meant living in ways that honored what they were, not what he needed them to be. When would this happen? Graham says another 2 weeks, maybe 3. Give Storm's leg time to fully heal. Make sure the foals are strong enough for the transition. We'd move them together, of course. Keep the family intact. Tom nodded slowly, watching Storm nuzzle Ember with that particular gentleness that mothers seem to access instinctively. "Tell your grandmother I appreciate the offer. And yes, when they're ready, her place sounds like exactly what they need." Ruby smiled, relief evident on her face. "You could visit whenever you want. Graham already said so, and I'll need help managing them, especially if Storm stays wild. This wouldn't be goodbye, just different." That night, after Ruby had left and the barn had settled into its familiar nocturnal rhythms, Tom sat on his cot thinking about change and loss and the particular pain of doing the right thing when the right thing cost you something you'd come to value. Storm watched him from the stall, her dark eyes reflecting lamplight, and Tom wondered what she understood about human emotion, whether she could sense the bittersweet quality of his mood. "You found your way back to them," Tom said quietly. "Covered who knows how many miles, injured, and desperate, refused to give up until you were together again. That kind of determination deserves a reward. Deserves good pasture and clean water and room to raise your daughters without humans interfering more than necessary." Storm blinked slowly, then lowered her head to check on Willow, who'd fallen asleep pressed against her mother's side. The gesture was so tender, so fundamentally maternal, that Tom felt his throat tighten. He'd been without Caroline for 2 years, had thought he'd processed the loss, had made his peace with solitude. But watching this horse family, seeing the bonds that connected them, had opened something in his chest that he'd kept carefully sealed. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange state of suspended time, where Tom was simultaneously present in each moment and aware of those moments counting down toward an ending. He documented the foal's progress with photos on his ancient phone, capturing Ember's exuberant personality and Clover's dreamy presence and Willow's quiet observation. He watched Storm's confidence grow as her injury healed, saw her begin testing the stall boundaries as if remembering the wide spaces she'd come from. Dr. Morgan did a final examination 3 days before the scheduled move, declaring all 4 horses fit for transition. Storm's leg had healed remarkably well, and the foals showed no lingering effects from their near-death experience. She stood with Tom afterward, both of them watching the horses through the stall opening. "You did something extraordinary here," she said. "Most people would have called it in, let it be someone else's problem. But you pulled those foals from that ravine, fought for them when the odds were terrible, and gave their mother time to find them. That mare and those babies are alive because of choices you made." Tom shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "Just did what needed doing. That's what makes it extraordinary. Doing what needs doing even when it costs you." She paused, then added, "The grant came through, by the way. It'll cover about 60% of your expenses. Not everything, but enough to keep you from drowning in debt over this." The relief was physical, a weight lifting from shoulders that had been carrying it so long he'd stopped noticing the burden. "I appreciate everything you've done. The flexible payment, the grant application, all of it. Consider it an investment in humanity. We need more people who'll choose compassion over convenience." She packed her equipment and left, and Tom returned to the barn to continue preparations for the move. Moving day arrived with cloudless skies and temperatures that were merely hot rather than punishing. Ruby arrived early with a trailer borrowed from her grandmother's neighbor. Larger than Tom's small property, would accommodate but necessary for transporting all 4 horses safely. They'd planned the process carefully. Storm first, to reduce her anxiety about being separated from her foals, then the 3 young ones together. Storm initially refused to approach the trailer, her wild instincts telling her that enclosed spaces meant danger. But Tom had been working with her over the previous days, building trust through patient consistency, and eventually she allowed herself to be led up the ramp. She called constantly for her foals, distress evident in every line of her body, but didn't panic. Getting the foals loaded proved easier. Ember walked right up, curiosity overcoming caution, and once she was inside, Clover and Willow followed with minimal resistance. Tom secured them carefully, ensuring they had adequate ventilation and space, then stepped back to look at the 4 horses who'd reorganized his life over the past month. The drive to Ruby's grandmother's property took 40 minutes, Tom following the trailer in his truck with Copper riding shotgun. The dog had been subdued all morning, as if sensing that change was coming. Tom kept one hand on Copper's head, taking comfort from the solid warmth of the animal who'd been his constant companion through everything. Ruby's grandmother's land was everything Ruby had described. Rolling pasture that had stayed greener than surrounding properties thanks to that spring-fed pond, solid fencing that would contain horses without feeling like a prison, and a 3-sided shelter that would provide protection from weather without closing the animals in completely. The old woman stood waiting, leaning on a cane but smiling with genuine warmth. Unloading went smoothly. Storm emerged first, her head high and nostrils flaring as she assessed this new territory. When the foals joined her, she immediately began herding them toward the pond, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. They moved as a unit across the grass, Storm leading with Ember close behind, Clover drifting slightly apart but staying within sight, and Willow bringing up the rear with that peculiar combination of caution and determination that characterized everything she did. Tom, Ruby, and her grandmother stood watching as the horse family explored their new home. Storm stopped at the pond's edge, testing the water carefully before drinking deeply, and the foals followed her example. Then she led them on a circuit of the pasture, checking boundaries, identifying the best grazing spots, beginning the process of claiming this space as territory. "They'll be happy here," Ruby's grandmother said. "I can tell already. Storm knows a good situation when she sees it, and those babies will have everything they need to grow up strong." Tom nodded, not trusting his voice. He'd known this moment was coming, had prepared for it, but actually watching the horses move away into their new life created an ache he hadn't fully anticipated. Ruby's hand found his arm, a gesture of understanding that didn't require words. They stayed for another hour, ensuring the horses settled, confirming they understood where food and water were located, watching Storm begin to relax as she realized this place was safe. Finally, Ruby's grandmother suggested they head back, give the family time to adjust without human observation. Tom approached the fence one last time. Storm was grazing with her daughters nearby, all 4 of them engaged in the simple, essential act of being horses. Willow noticed him first, lifting her head to watch with those luminous eyes. For a moment, Tom thought she might approach, but she only observed him with that characteristic patience, as if acknowledging his presence without needing to alter her behavior in response. "Take care of each other," Tom said quietly, the words carried away by the Montana wind. The drive back felt longer than the drive out. Tom's barn, when he pulled up to it, seemed suddenly too large and too empty. He stood in the entrance where he'd spent so many hours watching the horses, and the absence of their sounds and smells and presence felt almost unbearable. Copper leaned against his leg, and Tom's hand found the dog's head. Automatically, they stood together in the empty barn, man and dog, both of them adjusting to loss that was also victory, to ending that was also beginning. That night, Tom couldn't bring himself to move back into the main sleeping area. He stayed in the space that had been the stall, sitting on the cot he'd dragged there weeks ago, surrounded by the lingering evidence of equine occupation. His phone buzzed with a text from Ruby. "They're doing great. Storm found the best grazing spot and everyone's settling in. Graham says you can visit tomorrow if you want. Tom replied, thanks. I'll come by. He set the phone aside and lay back on the cot, staring up at the barn rafters where dust motes swirled in the last light. The building felt haunted by recent presence, echoing with ghosts of nickering and the rustle of straw under restless hooves. He'd pulled 3 dying foals from a ravine a month ago, made choices that had cost him financially and physically and emotionally, and had somehow arrived at this moment where they were safe and thriving and no longer his responsibility. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of another kind of ravine, looking down at emptiness that no longer held even the terrible purpose of desperate creatures needing rescue. But as sleep finally claimed him, Tom's last conscious thought was of Willow's eyes watching him across the pasture, of the intelligence and awareness there, and the recognition that some connections didn't require physical proximity to persist. He'd given those horses a chance at survival when they had none. They'd given him something harder to name, proof that choosing to care, even when the cost seemed unsustainable, could produce outcomes worth every sacrifice. The drought continued. The bank's extension would eventually expire. The mortgage would come due. But Tom Wallace had pulled 3 foals from death and reunited them with a mother who'd crossed miles of harsh country to find them. That accomplishment, that small defiance of probability and circumstance, couldn't be repossessed or foreclosed upon. It existed independent of financial realities, a moment of grace in a life that had contained too few of them recently. And tomorrow he would visit them in their new home. And the day after, and the day after that, because some bonds, once formed, didn't break just because geography changed. Some things you carried with you regardless of where you ended up sleeping. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.